How can the surge in ketamine be stopped? The cheap, widely available drug can shred and shrink users' bladders, leaving them constantly rushing to the toilet.
Still go in the toilet every 20 to 30 minutes, sometimes it's every 2 to 5 minutes.
It can even kill, with Friends actor Matthew Perry and drag star the Vivienne both dying after taking the drug in recent years. The government is deliberating on whether to reclassify the drug from Class B to Class A, bringing harsher punishments for supply and possession. But will that put people off?
It is a harmful drug. It's taken my brother's life.
Since it has been criminalised, deaths have increased from around 15 in 2014 to nearly 200 last year. So why are we doing more of that? We should be doing what we know works.
I'm Lucy Watson, and this is What You Need to Know. Well, joining me is our digital reporter, George Hancorn, who carried out the investigation into ketamine and who recently visited specialist clinics, and in particular one for under 16s, the first of its kind up in the Northwest. We're also joined by Steve Rawls, who is Senior Policy Analyst at the Transform Drug Policy Foundation. And you campaign, don't you, Steve, for the legal regulation of these drugs. George, we'll come to you first, I think, probably, because you did this report and it was absolutely fascinating. We will get on to the question of reclassifying ketamine. But first, just explain to me, in all the research and the work you've done over months and months, how much is this on the rise, the taking of this drug?
So we know in the last kind of decade or so, the use of this has doubled, and there are lots of different figures you can look at. You can also look at kind of those that have been seeking treatment for this over the last 10 years. We know that's gone up by 12 times, which obviously, again, kind of there's a little bit of nuance with these figures, because you could say, well, more people are coming forward because there's more of a conversation about this sort of stuff. So when it comes to the figures being borne out, I mean, we can see that this is more than doubled over the last 10 years. And the latest round of figures go up to March 2023, but it'll be very interesting to see kind of how this lands over the next couple of years. And we do know that the use is huge between that kind of 16 to 24 age group, and that is a group where use is still increasing.
Now, when I first watched George's documentary, initially the first thing I wanted to know is why. Why is this use of this particular drug on the rise? I remember it from my university days being kind of around, and why it was used then. Why is it on the rise? And what is it about this drug that has an appeal?
Well, I mean, I think one of the key reasons why use of ketamine has risen is because it's really quite cheap. A gram of ketamine generally costs between £10 and £20, but can often cost less, like less than £10, sometimes as little as £5 or £7 a gram. It's fairly short acting, it's relatively easy to manage. You don't have to commit to hours and hours of an intense drug effect like you might do with magic mushrooms or LSD or MDMA. It's much cheaper than comparable drugs like cocaine. I think it just appeals to young people in this particular day and age. And it, certainly compared to the cost of legal drugs like alcohol.
Now, I'm presuming you've not taken it yourself, Steve, but what is the effect? What does it do to you?
Well, it's a dissociative anaesthetic, and it is actually used medically in emergency situations as an anaesthetic, widely in the UK and around the world. It has a kind of dissociative, psychedelic type effect. At lower doses, it's perhaps a bit like using cannabis or lower dose magic mushrooms. At higher doses, it can have very much more profound effects. People talk about going into the K-hole, where you have a sort of dissociative effect, out of body type experience, viewing yourself, or in a sort of, some people talk about being like a robot or an alien. But that is a much more intense doses. But right. It's quite short acting. It's only effective for half an hour. So young people find it more manageable to use in certain social contexts.
Okay, so we've addressed the appeal. George, what are the risks?
So the risks, as they are kind of appear, are risks to your bladder. So it's worth saying this is kind of not something that happens immediately. This is obviously after consistent use over a period of time. But the issue is that the kind of side effects when it comes to your bladder don't appear straight away and also affect different people in different ways. So we spent a lot of time as part of this documentary in both Alderhay Children's Hospital, where they've opened the UK's first kids cat clinic basically, but also Aintree Hospital, and they will be seeing patients who are quite young, who are using the drug on a relatively regular occasion, often kind of between 3.5, sometimes up to 7 grams a day at various intervals of use. And what they're seeing is
at that point, George,
bladder...
Steve just gasped at the notion of 7 grams. I mean, that seems small to me, but in the scale of ketamine, that's a massive dose, is it?
That's a huge amount. Like any drug, like alcohol, some people will have a glass of wine with their meal and it's not a problem. Other people, if they're drinking, a litre of rum at breakfast every day, it's a massive problem. There is a spectrum of using behaviours and it's associated with a spectrum of risks. But with ketamine, there is this very distinct group of profound risks for heavy, frequent users, and unfortunately, we are seeing more and more of that in the UK.
But the very fact we are talking about it, the very fact that there is one of these clinics for under 16s, it implies to me that this is becoming much more of an issue. Talking about the damage again, George, so let me get this right. So it damages the bladder lining, that's right, isn't it? But it can ultimately shrink totally, is that right?
Yeah, so that can have an impact on your bladder and your kidneys. So the regular use of this drug can essentially kind of serrate and scar the bladder lining, which ultimately leads to it shrinking. And if you're using the drug and you're in pain, your bladder hurts, I mean, the easiest thing to reach for that you're familiar with is more ketamine. So if you're trying to deal with the pain, often then ketamine is used to kind of deal with that. And we saw that, patients, and speaking from doctors, patients would pop out to the loo halfway through, and the doctors there were pretty sure that they were probably taking more ketamine to help with that pain. So what they do in this clinic is they try and essentially get like a repair fluid inside the bladder. So they need to use pipes to put that inside. And if they can do this regular treatment, essentially the bladder lining can start to repair. And over time, after not taking the ketamine, the size of the bladder can slowly start to build back up. But it is worth saying that it is not, if you're in a position where your bladder has shrunk that much, it's not going to, go back to how it was before you ever took ketamine. And then, of course, these are in more extreme cases. This doesn't happen to everyone. And there is a difference between the sorts of things that people see. And this is what the medics that we speak to, this is the trickiest thing. When it comes to advice, everyone's bodies reacts differently. No one person reacts in the same way if they're using the same amount over a period of time. And that's often why it's so hard to deliver that care, of course, with the lack of funding and services as well, which is kind of a wider issue.
George, the government is considering reclassifying ketamine. Can you just give me, I'm sure Steve doesn't need it, but can you give us a bit of a background to that and what it actually means?
Yeah, let's do a little bit of a history lesson. So let's start with something called the Misuse of Drugs Act. So this kind of determines where stuff should sit. So in 2006, ketamine became a Class C under that act. In 2014, it then was moved up to a Class B, and it was over concerns about recreational use. And that meant you could get up to 5 years in prison for possession, up to 14 years for supply. And if the government does move it up to a Class A, and they're obviously considering that expert advice at the moment, that would mean up to 7 years in prison for possession and potentially life in prison if you were supplying the drug. And they're currently considering advice from the ACMD. So that is their advisory council on the misuse of drugs. And when we reached out to them, as you have to do for all these sorts of stories to essentially allow them to respond, they said the biggest concern was that they're really worried about the rise in the use of ketamine among young people, and they described it as being deeply concerning. I'm just going to read you what they said when they followed up. So they said, as we've explained, we've requested advice from the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, so their expert panel, as they would see it, about reclassifying it as a Class A drug, and we'll consider that advice carefully and quickly once received.
I mean, reclassifying drug, there are so many different things to consider, and people come at it from two positions. I know that Steve is chomping at the bit to talk on his side, but just very quickly, we are going to talk, I know that George spoke to Chanel Williams, who is the sister of the drag star, the Vivienne, who died last year from cardiac arrest after taking ketamine. And Chanel now supports reclassifying. She wants it to be a Class A drug. So let's just have a little listen to her first.
For me, instantly, looking at my brother's story, it is a harmful drug. It's taken my brother's life. So I really was passionate about making that change and having the drug reclassified to a Class A. I stand by that.
Chanel stands by that. She wants it to be Class A. You definitely don't. Go on, Steve, why?
I mean, I understand that response. But there are other people in George's film, including the chair of my organisation, Transform, my charity, Vivienne, who have lost loved ones. Vicky's daughter Louise died after taking ketamine with alcohol. She drowned in a bath. Tragically, who don't feel that increasing punishments for people who use ketamine, most of whom are young people, a vulnerable population, increasing punishments, increasing prison sentences for young people is the response to a growing health problem. That what we should be doing is a health-based response. So we do things that we know work, like better prevention, better treatment services, like that George has already talked about, and better harm reduction, letting people understand the risks of ketamine and other drugs so that they can make responsible choices. Those are evidence-based, sensible things to do. Increasing punishments for young people and penalties and prison sentences is not an evidence-based thing to do. And actually, when ketamine was criminalised in the first place and made, you could get 5 years for possession, use doubled. When they moved that up to 7 years for possession, use doubled again. Why are we... And during that time, since it has been criminalised, deaths have increased from around 15 in 2014 to nearly 200 last year. So, those are terrible outcomes from increasing criminalisation. Why are we doing more of that? We should be doing what we know works, which is evidence-based public health responses, and not doing this kind of performative tough on drugs posturing. Governments like to look tough on drugs and law and order and, show that how resolute and we are being seen to act. And just increasing penalties or increasing punishments or introducing new tough laws is a way for them to, get a good headline. What it doesn't do is deliver any useful outcomes. There is no evidence to suggest that making ketamine Class A will deter use in any meaningful way or will impact the size and scale of availability and illegal markets.
Having said all that, Steve, back in 2023, the possession of nitrous oxide, so laughing gas, we know it better as, that was made illegal, and use of that has come down since. Would that not have a similar effect?
The thing with nitrous oxide is that because people use these very noisy canisters and big, very visible balloons, there was a problem with public use. It's very hard to use kind of, in a discreet way. Public use is very visible, and you can see why a ban on nitrous oxide use would reduce public use. So in some ways, you can see why a ban on nitrous oxide might have more impact than something like pills and powders, where the use is very, discreet and hidden away. It's very hard to enforce laws against pills and powders because they're very easy to hide and they're very easy to use and they're very discreet. Whereas something, you have a big canister of gas and these enormous balloons and it's much more easy to enforce, certainly public use. But the question is, people who are using maybe less nitrous oxide, are they then using more of other drugs, including perhaps ketamine, which is another dissociative anaesthetic, like, in fact, nitrous oxide, and they're both used in emergency anaesthesia.
So for you, it's very much more, it should be much more about support and not punishment.
Yeah, there's no evidence that punishment delivers any good outcomes. It's not reducing use, it's not reduced the scale of markets, but it does create harms. It actually deters young people from approaching emergency services, for example. It's nothing to do with public health science. If they were following the public health science, they would be listening to their public health experts and decriminalising possession. They wouldn't be criminalising people for possession of drugs at all. It's a health issue, needs to be dealt with as one.
Let's bring it back to the users then. Now, George, as we have already talked about the fact that you've been to some of these treatment clinics, and spoken to several, if not many, users, and most of them were very brave and appeared, in front of the camera and talked. I mean, the thing I will not be able to take out of my mind is the woman Abby, who just got out of nappies because of her usage. What did you hear when you were talking to these people about what they think about this whole idea of, if there were tougher penalties, would that have stopped them using it?
I think it is a bit of a sliding scale. So, for instance, let's just take Chanel Williams, you mentioned there. So she obviously she wants the reclassification. Her argument is that at the moment, when we look at the way things are classified, we do just look at the kind of policing point of view. There isn't necessarily anything in there that is related to public health or anything like that. So she said, obviously, she doesn't want to go and put, loads of young people who are using it to end up in prison. But in terms of the parameters of how that decision is made, she's kind of it is based on what there is that she's got to look at, right? And I think we in the documentary also speak to Alder Hey, so the woman, Rachel Isba, who runs that clinic at Alder Hey Hospital. When I put it to her, how does she feel about potentially it becoming a Class A? She says, well, ketamine is already illegal, and we're already seeing what we're seeing. So she would rather focus on increasing services and funding and that kind of thing. We also have a round table with lots of parents. So we've got, this is led by Megan, who's a 22-year-old. So she's been clean from ketamine for 6 months now. Felt there wasn't enough support, so she set up her own support group in Skelmersdale, in just outside Liverpool. And she says that, again, maybe making it a Class A would help, but ultimately none of these people want to see young people who are using the drug and who are trying to come off the drug, if they're seeing kind of severe consequences from that, ultimately criminalized. I also thought it was interesting. I love a stat, Lucy. So we did some polling. ITV's Peston did some polling with Savanta recently. So we polled 1,000 young adults. These are between the ages of 18 to 25. And actually, these results kind of surprised me. So we asked them, we said, would you like to see more control over ketamine? Would you like to see it upgraded to a Class A? 64% of them said they wanted to see more control over it as a substance. 9% said less, and the others are unsure. And I was kind of surprised by that. Again, obviously a very small pool of people, only 1,000 young people. But I thought that was quite interesting. Again, who knows how you're going to answer in a survey of people? Are you going to be completely honest with that? But I think it definitely is a complicated issue, and not one that is necessarily has shared opinions across the whole piece.
Which obviously makes it very complicated when you are considering reclassification, if indeed the government is. Do we have any idea of when or a decision is likely to be made on by the government?
It's very hard to know if we're going to get anything. My inkling is that, Steve might have a bit more of an idea of this, but they're meeting with a lot of key stakeholders at the moment, the likes of Steve and his team and other people who have kind of similar views or opposing views. It appears that maybe when it comes to this sort of thing, it's quite an easy thing to put through. It doesn't need to go through Parliament. It's something that they can like an instrument they can just put through, and they can make it a Class A. My feeling is that maybe that's the way the government are leaning. But Steve has got his fingers in all those pies.
What's your intel, Steve?
Well, the government are definitely leaning that way, because they didn't just ask the ACMD, the Advisory Council, to do a review and then make a recommendation on classification. They said, will you see whether it should be a Class A? And there is an unfortunate and long history of the ACMD making recommendations which didn't align with the government's political priorities, and the government just ignores those recommendations and does what they're going to do anyway. Cannabis, for example, was reclassified down to C in the 2000s, and then back up to B against the advice of the Advisory Council. The Advisory Council said, don't ban nitrous oxide, don't bring it within the Misuse of Drugs Act.
In your informed estimation, are you anticipating that the government will make it?
I don't know. I think the sort of, as I understand it, there is a split in opinion within the Advisory Council, and so it may come down to the chair, and the chair has actually just changed. So Owen Bowden-Jones, who's been the chair of the ACMD for a number of years, has just stepped down, and there is a new chair in place, and it's on him to make the call. If there is a split within the council, he will have to call it, and I don't actually know which way that's going to go. But even if they do call for it to stay in B, my suspicion is the government will move it to A anyway, because they've clearly expressed that is their political desire, and this is all about sort of performative, signalling, rather than following the best evidence. Because public health advisors are always making recommendations, and that the government routinely ignores them if they don't think it's going to give them a good headline in the tabloids.
We shall see. Steve, thank you very, very much indeed for coming in and for chatting to us. And George, thank you for bringing this issue to our attention. I did not know about it until I started to talk to you about it. So thank you very much indeed. And you can watch George's full report at itv.com/news and on YouTube. We'll put links in the show notes. Have a watch. It's great. Until next time, thank you very much for joining us.